Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's class, Gouache Sunflower Painting Part 2. If you missed last week's class, you can find it easily on YouTube by searching the keywords Gouache Sunflower Painting Part 1. You can also search my name, Adrienne Hodge, and find a list of all of the classes that are free that we've done over the last couple years on Michaels. Through Michaels, there have been many of them since July 2021, since I began hosting these classes. So hang on one second, I'm messing with my view here. Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna go over supplies and we'll get started. And well, first, let me talk about what we did last week. So if you missed the class, feel free to stick around. You can watch tonight's class and then, go back and fill in the blanks with what you missed. And it might be kind of helpful to see where we're going to end up. And if you're watching later on YouTube, then you can just pause this, go back and watch part 1, and then come back to part 2. But if you're here live, you might as well stick around. So I'm joining you from my studio in East Austin, Texas. And all of these classes use supplies purchased at Michaels. I'm going to switch to my tabletop view and we will go over supplies. Okay, so last week, well, I'll review what we did last week in just a moment. So first, for supplies, we're using gouache, as we mentioned. And if you're unfamiliar with gouache, it is an opaque watercolor. And we're using this set by Holbein. It's acrylic gouache, and it's a 5-piece primary set. And if you can't find this in store, you can find it on michaels.com and have it delivered for curbside pickup or to your home. So that's the paint that we're using. You can substitute with watercolor or acrylic paint. This is an acrylic-based gouache. So what that means is it's just got a polymer base to it. So as we're working, most gouache can be reconstituted later and you can continue to use it even after it's dried up. This particular gouache will dry with a little kind of plastic film. So you really want to just use it one time and then clean your palette and start fresh once it has dried on your palette. But just mentioning that did come up last week if you missed it. Okay, so and then we're using these Princeton brushes. I believe I only put these 2 on the supply list, the size 1 and the size 6. They're the Aqua Elite Princeton brushes, but I also have a size 1/2-inch flat brush here, and I might use that one. We'll see, but I think pretty much everything can be done with those other 2. Last week we had a sketch pad and we did some sketching. This week we're not going to do that. We're going to be moving on to just working with the watercolor paper, and the watercolor paper that I have is in this Strathmore watercolor sketchbook. And I've got a little clip on it on the side to keep it weighted and open flat on my desk. So that's the sketchbook that we're using. You can use any watercolor paper or any mixed media paper that you have on hand, but you definitely want some paper that can handle some water weight. Okay, and then you're going to want either a plastic mixing palette, or I like to use these ceramic dishes. So I've got a couple of got a big one and a small one, a ceramic dish. I've also got some shop towels. Paper towel works perfectly fine. I just happen to have shop towels in my studio. And then a couple of water cups are good. And that should be it. Any questions about supplies?
No questions about supplies so far.
Okay, great. And don't forget to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes. And you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art. I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. And there's some of my work on my business cards. I'm always flashing on the screen there. And I am planning to do a quick little Q&A after class. I haven't done it in a while, but I was doing them consistently. So if there are any leftover questions at the end, I'm going to do just a 10-minute Q&A on Instagram right after the class ends. And if you're watching this later on YouTube, you'll be able to find the recording of that on my Instagram as well. If you just click on like the videos, they're all together on one tab. It should be there even if you miss it live. And yeah, so I'll just be answering any leftover questions about gouache or upcoming classes. And speaking of upcoming classes, I realized that was the other thing I wanted to talk about. Well, I had the camera forward facing here. It's right behind me. I'm going to talk about the class we have coming up next week and the following week. It's going to be another water media painting class. We're going to be using watercolor. It's called Easy Watercolor Painting Part 1 and 2. So this is the finished product at the end of class number 2, and Part 1 will be beginning our layers. So very similar to what we're doing here with the gouache, only using watercolor. So if you feel like this process is new to you and you're struggling with color mixing, then you can join us for that easy watercolor class. It's going to be a few less colors in the palette. Instead of, I didn't count how many colors we have here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 colors that we're mixing, pre-mixing for this one. And we started last week. And then this one only has 6. So half the number of colors to mix for this little sunset with some power lines and some trees silhouetted over it. And then the class, the last week of September, is a portrait class on head tilts. And I have that one right here as well in my sketchbook. So we'll be working from an image of a model and talking about diagramming the head when the head is tilted in any directions. So, and photos are provided for all of those classes that are coming up, and all of them are free. Okay, so moving on, we will get back to where we left off last week in part 1. Okay, so it seemed like we didn't get that far, but we're doing all the hard work with this class on the front end. And then I love to joke whenever I do this process that the painting just paints itself, because there are 2 things that tend to make people give up on a painting. And that is either that they are struggling to render what's happening in their reference photo. So we started out by sketching our reference photo first and talking about what we were going to focus on, creating this sort of whimsical interpretation of this photo of a sunflower and a butterfly, and that we're not looking for hyper-realism here. At least I'm not. But we are looking for a little bit more realism when it comes to the colors. So, one second, let me just get our reference photo up. I'm going to be using it on my phone because as I'm talking, I just realized that's the one thing I forgot to bring with me to the studio today was my iPad that has our sunflower reference photo on it. So I'll just use it on my phone tonight. I think that should be fine. Okay, so I'll just zoom in here. So we're working with this portrait of a sunflower where I made the background really blurry. And then we've got that butterfly resting on the sunflower. We are going for matching the colors. So that's where we left off last week, is we're matching all those colors, because that's the second thing that causes people to give up when they're working on a painting. Is they'll get to a point where they're trying to mix up a certain color, like one that was causing us not trouble, but one that some people were struggling with a little bit last week was this kind of army green color, which we first mixed up a brown, and then we added we made a green, and then we added a little bit of brown to our green to get that army green to happen. But you might be trying to mix up a brown to add to the green, and it might get so frustrating in that process that you give up. But if we sketch it beforehand, if we mix and match all the colors beforehand, then hopefully as we're painting, we're not going to give up because we've already done all the hard work. And then now all we have to do is the fun part, which is paint it. Okay, so where we left off, we were creating our palette last week. And so the first thing we did was we mixed up, well, we didn't have to mix it. We just started with our yellow. So let's get all of our colors squeezed out on our palette again and just get right back to where we were last week. So the first thing we're going to do is get a little bit of all of our primary colors on one of our palettes. Start. So we're putting a little bit of red, yellow, and blue. And we'll worry about that white and black in just a minute when we start to create this gray that we're going to need for the butterfly. Okay, and I'm going to move my painting out of the way for a second and just have my color mixing going here. Okay, so first thing we did was paint our little swatch of yellow. You always want to start with your lighter color first, and you want to take your colors to a separate place on your palette to mix them. So even though we already have that pile of yellow, just pulling some yellow off to the side just to get that swatch of yellow to happen. But I'm not going to redo everything we did last week. I kind of started acting like that's what I was doing. Then we made the orange, because if you missed it, you can go back and watch it. So we're just going to jump back to where we were. So we made an orange, then we made a brown so that we could add a little bit of brown to our orange. And then we made a green, and then we used that brown that we had already made to add it to our green. Okay, so the next thing we need to make is we've got a couple more greens we want to make too. So let's go ahead and make a green and a brown so we can mix up these different levels of green that we have here. So we need a little bit of blue to add to this yellow to turn it green. And I think we already had a little swatch of just a nice kind of Kelly green is what I'd call this. So if you don't have that yet, go ahead and paint a little swatch of this green, this very Irish look of the Irish Kelly green. Okay. And then we want to make a very yellowish green. So we'll start out with our yellow, our lighter color first. And then I'm cleaning my paintbrush before I dip it in that green. So I can just pull a little bit of that green over here and I can get a really, although I always say I'm not going to contaminate my colors and then I just start doing it. So in a perfect world, you do as I say, not as I do with my palette sometimes. Okay, so we want a very yellowish green, which actually that looks pretty close to what we already did last week. But if you don't have that yet, go ahead and paint a swatch of that.
Adrienne, we have a couple questions.
Okay.
Hold on one second. Diana asked, for your color mixing to get this palette, do you typically write down the color combos? I'm terrible at remembering how I get these.
Yes. I do, and I suggested that last week as well. So yeah, definitely continue doing that if you haven't already, you know, have a pencil or a pen on hand and you can write down next to it how you got there. I don't always do that now because at this point I've kind of gotten pretty good at knowing how I got there, but that's really helpful to make notes of how you got to each color so that you can remember for next time.
Okay, and then the second question is from Dorothy. Sequence in painting, light to dark, dark to light, or does it matter?
We are going to start kind of in the order that I've been doing them so far. Um, yeah, because we're gonna start with the background of the sunflower in yellow, and then we're gonna add that kind of mustard yellow where we're seeing it, and then we're gonna add that army green where we're seeing it in the photo, etc. And then that more pure orange is kind of the last layer. So maybe not exactly in order of how I have them here, but that's just how I laid them out before. But we're going to go from background forward with these colors. And then we will bounce around a little bit, you know, while we let certain things dry. We'll work on the background and um I don't have like a perfect strategy there. Mostly I just, you know, I try to work in like if something's wet, then I leave it alone for a second. But background to foreground is the best policy so that you don't kind of paint yourself into a corner with you know, something in the foreground and the need to add background in between it. If that answers that question. Okay, so we need to make a brown again so that we can add that to this, well, so that we can just make a brown because we need brown for the center of the sunflower here. Okay, so there's lots of different ways to make brown, and we talked about it last week, and we got a little stuck on that for a little bit. So I shared a class on painting skin tones that we had done around this time last year because that class really goes into detail about painting browns since our skin tones tend to fall within different ranges of brown. So who remembers what those complementary colors were from last week that we can mix together to make brown? I'm not going to go into detail repeating it all since, you know, that was part one, but who remembers how we made brown? You can just drop it in the chat. Okay, I see red and green. Thank you, Rhonda. And there's two more sets of complementary colors we can mix together to get brown. Blue and orange, thank you, Joey. And then one more. Yellow and purple. Okay, thank you, Amy. All right, so let's do red and green since we already have our green here. So we're going to start with our magenta, which is our primary red. And we're going to add this green to it. I'm going to make a little more green so that I've got a nice little pile here. Okay, and sometimes as we're trying to make brown happen, what happens is there was a little more blue probably in our green, and it's mixing with the red, and so it's turning this more of like a purple ish brown. So we know that the complementary color that will neutralize purple is yellow. So if we add a little bit of brown to this, I'm sorry, a little bit of yellow, it should turn it pretty brown. And if it's looking kind of green, we can add more red. We're just always going to go back and forth between those complements to neutralize a color. If it's showing up more green, you add red. If it's showing up more purple, you add yellow. If it's showing up blue, you add some orange. Get the idea. Okay, so we want a nice dark chocolatey brown to happen there, and we might even make it a little darker than that. Really, you just keep adding your primaries together, and you're eventually going to get brown to happen. So yeah, that's what I want, is a nice dark chocolatey brown. So it's so dark brown it almost looks black when we paint the swatch. Okay, and then we do want some black. So that was actually my brown right there. It was just so dark it was looking black. We'll squeeze out a little bit of black and white because we need to make a gray next as well for that butterfly. Okay, so let's go ahead and paint a swatch of black while we have it there. Right, and then I'm aware that there are some other questions about how we make some of the colors we've already made so far. I'm not going to repeat that just because I want us to get started on the painting, and I'm afraid we're going to run out of time to actually paint this thing. So I'm going to try to move us along pretty quickly here. If I've gone too fast, or if you need me to repeat a color and how I made it from last week, I'm going to have to ask that you just be patient until a time when you can go back and rewatch part 1. Okay, so I mixed up a little black and white together, starting with the light color first to get a gray. And we want 2 different tones of gray. We want a very pale gray, and we want a little bit darker gray. So I've got a little bit darker gray on there already. So the more white, less black for the paler gray, and a little bit more black for the darker gray. So we want like a really baby's breath of gray to happen here. So start with your white and just slowly add your gray. Okay, so we've got both of our grays. And then I think I ended up making some of the same colors twice. We've got that paler green. Maybe we need one that's a little bit paler. So like a lot of yellow. And just a little bit of green. Yeah, we definitely want one that's super limey for that background. Something like that. Okay, I think that's pretty good. What do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think I made 13 somehow. Okay, I think I made one of those greens twice. That's what happened. All right, so like I said last week, we can paint this directly on the same page as your little palette swatches there, or if you want to do it on a separate page, choose your own adventure here. Make some space so I can have my palette right here on the screen as well, or kind of slightly off screen. Okay, let's get this thing rolling. At 35 minutes until the end of the hour. Okay, so starting just like we did in our sketch, remember we talked about that kind of oval shape that the whole thing makes, and then we're thinking about leaving space blank in the center for the center of the sunflower and for that butterfly. So we're gonna take our number 6 paintbrush, and we're gonna go kind of fast with all this. So definitely, if you're painting along with me, be prepared for me to go a little fast, and you can always watch the playback later and slow it down if I do go too fast. So I'm just adding more yellow so I can make sure I've got lots of yellow. And we're gonna go kind of thick with this paint. So we're gonna load up our brush. We're gonna take this number 6 and we're gonna load it up pretty thick, get some water moving around with it. And we're gonna start about 2/3 of the way up in the center. Or not all the way, yeah, about 2/3 of the way up with this top petal here. And we're gonna kind of think about a sundial and making these points as we go all the way around. And we're gonna overlap them, and we're gonna make them kind of leave this empty space in the middle as we go. Okay, so we want to make them come to a little bit of a point at the end. And I'm going to start with the point and just drag it down. Or you can go the opposite way and then make it end on a point, however you want to do it. We're getting these nice, big, juicy petals to happen. Remember, they're a little shorter on this side. So we want them nice and short and fat, coming to a point. And our paintbrush really kind of imitates the shape that they're making, so it doesn't take too much forcing to make that happen. And then right about here is where we want to leave space for that butterfly. So start thinking about where the butterfly is coming into it. This is why starting with the points and then going back that way might make it a little easier. And since gouache is so opaque, if you make a mistake at this point, it's pretty easy to paint over it. Okay, so I've jumped back to the other side here. I'm still thinking about that negative space in the center. And it does not have to be perfect. And we're going to use that dark brown to create that shape in the center so it can overlap these petals a little bit if it has to. And I feel like I need to be going out a little bit bigger to make more space here, especially for that butterfly. Okay, so something like that. Boy, my butterfly is going to have to be a little tiny this time. That's okay. So hopefully you left a little bit more space in your center than I did. But if you didn't, then it's a good example of how we're gonna go over that in just a bit. In fact, let's go ahead and, well, no, let's not do it yet because it's gonna mix with the yellow and change colors a little bit here. So we're gonna leave it alone for a second and let it dry so that we can come back in on top of it. But you're going to see it's so opaque. Once this is dry, which is going to dry very quickly, we'll be able to put another layer on top of it. So we'll go ahead and jump to this green that we're seeing on the stem of the sunflower, which is that limey green. So yeah, we're definitely not going exactly in order of those swatches, and that is okay. I hope nobody's concerned with that. I'll be honest, when I'm planning these classes, it's easier to go in the order that I would prefer because I can wait a minute and let things dry. So what I would like to do next is go ahead and put that orange and the mustard yellow and the green and start layering on top of that yellow. But since it's still so wet, I don't want to do it yet. So that's why I'm bouncing over to the stem. It's really just because we're on a time crunch that I'm going in this direction this time. I definitely went more in order of those swatches last time. Okay, so I loaded up my brush with that limey green, and I'm starting at maybe 8 o'clock on our little sundial here, and just giving a diagonal brush stroke, dragging down the page for the main color on that stem, that lighter green. And then once that's dry, we'll go over it with a darker green to give it a little dimension. Okay, and we're still waiting I'm still waiting for my yellow to dry. So while I'm waiting for the yellow to dry, we can go ahead and do some of these other leaves in the background. So you might need to make more of your green if it dried up, like mine dried up a little bit here. So I'm going to make that Kelly green. And actually, let's make kind of a big pile of our Kelly green and our darker green so that we can work on the background for a minute while we're waiting for the sunflower petals to dry.
Adrian, we have a question.
Okay.
Karen says she has water and acrylic paints, but not gouache. Which would be best for this class?
Oh, it's up to you. So your gouache is kind of in the middle of a spectrum. And I usually will say that ink is closer to the end of the spectrum between watercolor and ink. You've got gouache in the middle because it's opaque, kind of like ink is. But you know, if you're talking about water or acrylic, acrylic's kind of on the other end of the spectrum instead of ink, and your gouache is like right in the middle. So it's up to you. If you're more inclined to use watercolor, use watercolor. If you're more inclined to use acrylic, because they're both so different. But gouache, this acrylic gouache is kind of somewhere in the middle of those two as well. Okay, so working on these leaves. So we'll get some big shapes, big leaf shapes to happen down here. And remember, we're going for whimsical with this, so we're not going for hyper realistic. So we just want kind of the edge of some of these leaves. And the beautiful thing about gouache is that you can water it down and you can treat it more like watercolor, or you can use it really thick and treat it more like ink or like acrylic when it's more thick. But I would say it behaves more like ink than it does acrylic. But this particular gouache has acrylic in it, so obviously it's got those plasticky qualities. Okay, so I'm just watering it down a little bit and getting a nice big leafy shape to happen here. And then I'm going to go really quickly and really watery and just spread this like blurry light green all the way around. And I'm mostly just doing this to kill time right now while I wait for that background layer of yellow to dry. We might as well be productive. Oops, that was startling. Something just kind of dropped on an easel across the room. The little easel, you know, the ladder steps on the easel just clinked into place. Okay, so we're just spreading that light green around, and see, I've got it like really fun over here in the background. I'm kind of twisting my brush and getting this kind of blurry impression of this background tree to happen. So use a couple of your different greens that we have mixed here. So we'll use kind of a darker version of our green and our lighter version of our green, and we're just jumping around to get this kind of impression of the background to happen. I like to think of like a heart rate monitor for this tree line we talked about last week. And yeah, you can put it on the page kind of thick and then just dance your brush around into it and let these very blurry impressionistic things happen. And notice I'm not getting too close to the sunflower yet because I want us to get in there with the black. So I'm kind of breaking that rule about the background foreground because we are going to paint in between those sunflowers in just a bit, but that's also going to give us an opportunity to clean up some of those edges if you missed an opportunity to get like a nice clean point to happen there on those sunflower petals. So make it kind of fun, really spreading it around in a free-form sort of way. And if yours is not happening in a loose, fun way, you can practice on a separate piece of paper, getting things really loose. So I just noticed we left the blue sky out of this. If you wanted to add some blue sky back there, you definitely could, but I didn't do that. Okay, my petals look pretty dry now, so I think we're ready to add some of these other colors and start going more in order of that palette. Okay, so we've got our brown already, and we want to add a little bit of brown to our yellow to get that mustardy yellow to happen again from last week. Once you've got your mustard yellow, we're going to switch to this size 1 brush. What are we doing on time? Okay, we got 22 minutes. Okay, so see, we're just going to go in the center there, and we're looking at how these little overlaps in the petals are happening. So we don't want to go too far with this. Like, less is more when we're adding a color like this. And we're just going to notice where those little overlaps are happening with this mustard yellow. So it's where your petals are touching. It may not be exactly like the photo, so pay attention to where your petals touch. When those two yellows overlap each other, they kind of create this little shadow that looks like this mustard yellow. So we're more just given the idea of what we see in the photo, and we want to adapt it to the shapes that you painted. You don't want to force it, or else it's not going to make sense. So I'm only painting it where I've got my petals actually overlapping so that it makes sense with my painting. And we can always go back in and add some of this if we feel like we need more. I like to joke that it's like, you know, anytime there's a new color that we're adding in a painting, I like to joke it's like trimming your bangs. You can always, or trimming your beard or trimming your hair in any way. You can always trim a little bit more, but once you've trimmed it a bunch, you can't put it back. You got to wait for it to grow. So with the painting, we can always add a little bit more if we didn't add enough, but if we add too much, it's kind of hard to take it away. So opposite in that analogy, but still makes sense to me. Okay, so now we've got that army green. So we should already have some green on our palette. And then we've got our brown. So we're adding a little bit of our brown to our green to make that hunter green or that army green. So that answers that question somebody was asking earlier, how to make that hunter green. Okay, and then same thing. Now we're going next to our layer of that mustard yellow and looking at the photograph like, you know, we're just putting it in there where it makes sense with your petals. So where I'm seeing it in the photo is like in the center of the shadows. And maybe you put like 2 or 3 of them, 2 or 3 lines, you know, vibe it out a little bit and see what makes sense to you. But less is more, in my opinion. Sometimes when we're adding a new color, it can be like, yeah, this is really doing something cool. And then you want to add more of it, and then you can go a little too far with it. So That's what I mean about just add a little, and then you can always go back and add more if you feel like you need more. Okay. And then now we'll add some of that orange, which I need to make that orange again from last week. And it might be kind of hard to see that there's some orange on those petals. You can always tone it down a little bit if you feel like this bright orange is too much, like maybe mix it a little bit with your mustard yellow and make it more of like a burnt orange. All my Longhorns who may be in a University of Texas alumni, so I have to acknowledge that we're making a burnt orange there. So yeah, that kind of mustardy yellow with the orange will mix together and give us that orange. And then when we paint it, it still feels pretty bright, but that's just, you know, if yours is feeling really bright, you can tone it down like that. And again, I'm just kind of making a whimsical version of this sunflower. So the colors are somewhat realistic, somewhat exaggerated. But when I zoom in there, I really see orange where the light's hitting on several of those petals. Okay. Cheating a little bit and going back to my other one to see how I did certain things, if you haven't noticed. Okay, let's get this butterfly in there. So our titanium white is going to be our most opaque white in any set of paints that you have. And then we're working with gouache, which is very opaque. So if everything's dry, we should be able to get this butterfly to go on top of stuff, even if you went too far with your petals like I did. So I'm just painting the shape of that whole butterfly wing right there. And yeah, I'm definitely breaking that rule tonight of painting from the background forward, but it's mainly just I got out of order because of our time crunch. Okay. I definitely started sooner with this butterfly when I was painting on my own. So we'll paint in that whole big shape, and then we've got to let that dry. And while we're letting that dry, and I say it's totally fine if the butterfly shape is not exactly like the one in the photograph. So while we're letting that dry, we'll do the center of the sunflower. And if we run out of time, I always have to say when this happens, when I'm not quite as far as I'd like to be, that what I'll do is just go back to this one and I'll tell you how I got everything to happen, even if, you know, I don't get to do it in this example. I'll use my other example to finish us up here so that you can have the instructions to finish it on your own. Okay, so we need this dark brown again because the dark brown dried up, at least on my end. If you made some dark brown recently and it's still wet, then you're in a better spot than me, but I need to make a little bit more. So I'm going to start with, I feel like red and green get us to that dark brown the fastest. So first I need some green because my green also dried up. I'm just going to turn this entire pile on my palette green. And then add some red to that. And then I want it to be dark brown. Add some more blue. Maybe a little more red since it's looking kind of green again. Okay. I'm ready to paint the center of the sunflower. Okay, so I've got my size 6 brush back out again. And I think the last time I did this, I went kind of slowly and did like stippling dots or maybe like a wash of light brown first. So if you've got the time to do it that way, I suggest doing it a lighter brown first and finding the shape. Because remember when we sketched it, I really emphasized how we want to make it feel three-dimensional here. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and fill it in all dark brown. And I'm going really carefully around my butterfly shape there. And then we need that to dry so that we can get some dimension to happen to it. So I might have to go back to this example. So you can see I've got more dimension to my brown because I started with a lighter brown and then I added the dark brown kind of stippled on top of it. I'm trying to speed up the process a little bit here. So if you've got more time, start with a light brown, and then I used little dots of dark brown to darken it up and really made it feel nice and three-dimensional like that. Okay, let's start filling in some of these spaces in between our sunflowers while we're waiting for all that stuff in the center to dry. So this is going to take some careful finessing here. This is probably the trickiest part of the painting. We're going to get our black and we're going to water it down a little bit. Just get it nice and fluid. And I switched back to my size 6 brush. And we're going to really make our sunflower pop forward by going in between. I know it doesn't get like quite this solid black in between all of the petals, but we're just going to do it just to like really create some contrast here. And then if you don't have any green going still, mix up some more green so that we can kind of mix this black with the green in a really quick, fluid way. We're going to switch back and forth between our green and our black and let them bleed a little bit here. I see how it's like so blurry. So I'm using just the dark green here. Just that more Kelly green to go in between the petals. And you want to go as slow or as fast as makes sense to you. Sometimes quick movements, quick confident movements actually make things happen better than slower for me. But then I'm always so torn when I'm teaching stuff like this to go slowly so you can see how I'm doing it. So now that I've done a couple, I'm going to speed it up a little. And this is also an opportunity to, you know, clean up any weirdness on your petals since this paint is so opaque. Normally I say, you know, do the background first so you can work your way from the background forward. And we're definitely doing that on the petals themselves, but you know, with the colors that are overlapping. But with this background, we are going in between because we can use our background to fix any weird spots. Okay, and then yeah, I'm using the dark black because it does get pretty black in between some of these. And then we want to resist the urge to paint too much of this black. But we do want to bounce around and get it more into the background in a few spots. So with that watered down black, I'll kind of dance around a little bit where I'm seeing these little pockets of darker blurry black in the background. Does it happen? And like I said, just be really playful with it. Okay. Oh, we are right up against that clock, y'all. Okay, so the little oh, I want to make sure I talk about this part in the background before I start talking about the butterfly again. So we've got all those like blurry sunflowers in the background. So we want to get just our yellow on that size 6 brush again. And at some point get in there and do these like solid little, like I'm just twisting my brush to make some circles of yellow happen. And you could add a little white to them if they're not coming across as opaque as you want them. You could add a little white to this yellow, and that'll make them stand out on top of the green even more. But we'll just get a few of those, like dance those around into the background. And that'll, you know, give the idea of all these. You could even do like some little like stipple dot versions, like some starry versions of like the smaller sunflowers in the background, or ones that are farther away. And that'll be really fun. Okay. Where did I put my little brush? My size 1. Oh my goodness. I can't have gone far. Oh my God, it's right there in my water cup, but it was right next to the other one and looked like it was not there. It disappeared on me. Okay, so I need some white for, well, we need white and black and that darker gray again for the butterfly. I might need to just go back to the other one here. Okay, so we drew these shapes together. I'm just gonna point them out on here because I don't know that we have time to paint these all together right now. We're running out of time. So I just took my black and I did 1, 2, 3, 4 dots right there on the edge of the butterfly wings. So I'm just giving kind of the impression of this pattern. And then I used that darker gray and the lighter gray to paint these little patterns of little triangles. We drew them together in the part 1 class. And then you've got that really limey yellow again. And then we put some little like wispy lines on top of it in the limey yellow. So I'll just put a couple of these shapes on here with my darker gray. Ooh, that's too dark. And then we'll do the legs of the butterfly at least together. If you have a white gel pen, that could be a good alternative if you're struggling to get these legs to happen. You know, if your brush stroke, your brush control, you can also isn't what you want it to be for these. So see, I'm just painting these little triangle patterns on here with the darker gray. And then for the legs, we want just the white, and we want to load up our paintbrush, get it nice and fluid so that we can do it with one little brush stroke here, and whatever happens, that's the leg. So don't try to fix it if it doesn't happen. I would just paint a leg and then stop. And then if you want to paint the antenna on there, you can too. You got 3 little visible legs on there. Or you could leave the legs out. If you put them on there and you're like, ooh, I don't like that, you could easily take them off. Okay, and then I always like to add a little bit of star splatter. I feel like even though there weren't stars in the photograph, it just always gives it like an extra something. So the way that I do that, I load up that smaller paintbrush with the white, and I hold the paintbrush kind of tightly with one hand, and then I just tap it with the other hand, and that'll get a few little splattering dots to happen. And if you don't like them, you can always pull them out with your paper towel. You can also go in and, you know, make little dots like that. And then I did add a few little white dots, you know, along with a couple of different browns to that center there. So that was another detail. And then the background, I kind of went in with that green and did a few little, like, you know, fill in all these blanks, but I did like some scribbly lines too, to add just like that whimsical feeling. I did some like scribbly lines as well. And then, yeah, obviously we want to fill in all the blanks in the background. All right, I feel like we did it. We got pretty far. We didn't quite get every detail in this, but that was essentially it. I'd love to see some of your examples real quick in these last 2 minutes. And then I am going to be doing that Instagram live on my Instagram.
I'll pull up people's examples, but we did have one last question. You said something earlier about a blue sky. Was it that you didn't put it, but it, like, if they wanted to put a blue sky, they could?
Yeah, I noticed that we didn't put the blue sky that was in the background in the photo in there, but if you wanted to add, you know, blue to your background, you obviously can. Okay, very nice, Sarah. Yeah, that looks really great. You can, yeah, start spreading that background out a little bit more and filling in that background space. Thank you, Karen, for your lovely comment. Oh, I see some other nice examples in the crowd. Oh, yes, look at that. Oh, I love the stylized quality that's coming across in that one. Yeah, just keep going, filling in that background. Looks good. Okay, nice. Yeah. I love how different these all turned out. So yeah, don't be afraid to like be really playful with that background and add some water. That's the beautiful thing about gouache, is that we can get it nice and thick, or we can spread it around like watercolor and make it really loose and watery. Oh, that one's lovely. Yeah, speaking of loose and watery on the background, that's a great example of doing that. And I see you got a little blue going in that sky at the top as well. Ooh, I love all these examples. This is great. Yeah, I love your interpretation on those 3 different panels, like a little triptych here. You got 3 different versions of it going. That's a great way to work, doing multiple things at once. That way, you know, especially if you've got like your hands move fast. I love to do that. Do multiple things at once and then just pick my favorite one to keep developing. That one's really nice. Oh, look at those leaves in the foreground. Those are looking great. Yeah, we didn't add any. I didn't quite get to adding more dimension to those leaves, but that's great how you mixed that darker green with those lighter greens. I love that one. Ooh, this is another nice stylized version. And you can always go back in with your yellow too, if you know those other colors kind of took over. I know it's easy to be like, oh, I love these mustard greens and mustard yellows, and then it's like, oh wait, the yellow disappeared, but you can put it back in there. It's so fun how thick and opaque you can go back in and make it. So nice. Oh, that's another nice one. Love how loose and free your background is feeling. Ooh, that one's really nice. Look at those clean lines on the butterfly pattern. All right. All right, well, we've already gone a couple minutes over. Oh, look at that one. That's really good. I love how you splattered your white on there. And yeah, I love that push and pull between the thick and thin layers too. That's really the best way to utilize the gouache, is to really, push both of its qualities, I think. And then it creates that contrast between the thick and the watery layers. I love that example. Okay, so I'm going to be on my Instagram if you want to join me and keep asking questions or talking about this process. And I'll talk more about those classes that are coming up in the following weeks. Thank you all for joining me. And yeah, my Instagram was Adrienne Hodge Art. If you want to come over to Instagram, or if you're watching this recording later, you can go check out that Q&A later. All right, thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.